September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai's hand paused over the intelligence report, his one good eye, the other lost to American gunners a year earlier, over Guadalcanal, scanning words that made him laugh out loud in the humid operations tent where maps covered every surface. "The Americans have produced a new fighter," he read aloud to assembled pilots. "Heavy as a bomber, wide as a transport. They call it Hellcat." His voice dripped with contempt, earned through 2 years of aerial dominance. "Our intelligence suggests it weighs twice our Zero. Another American failure of design, another heavy machine that will fall before Japanese skill." Through the tent flaps, he could see his squadron's A6M Zeros lined up on the pierced steel, planking sleek, nimble, deadly machines that had rewritten the rules of Pacific warfare. For 2 years, these aircraft had dominated Pacific skies with mathematical certainty. British Hurricanes had fallen, American P-42s had burned, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes had been massacred. The Americans' latest attempt, this bloated Hellcat, would be no different. What Sakai didn't know, what none of the Japanese naval aviators gathering for their morning briefing could possibly imagine, was that in exactly 30 days, this failure would begin the systematic annihilation of Japanese naval aviation with industrial efficiency that would make mockery of samurai courage. The F6F Hellcat would achieve a kill ratio of 19-1, destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 inches. Aerial combat statistics that would transform carrier warfare, break the back of Japanese air power, and prove that the Zero's reign of terror had been built on a foundation of fatal assumptions about what made fighters effective. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were about to be rewritten by an aircraft that looked wrong, flew heavy, and seemed to violate every principle the Japanese had perfected through blood and victory. Yet within 6 months, the very pilots now laughing at intelligence reports would be writing final letters home, knowing with mathematical certainty that encountering Hellcats meant death, not honorable death in fair combat, but statistical elimination by a system they couldn't comprehend or counter. The Japanese Navy's confidence in September 1943 wasn't arrogance born of propaganda. It was mathematics written in burning American ships and shattered Allied aircraft. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had achieved victory ratios that defied every Western assumption about aerial combat capabilities. Pearl Harbor, 29 aircraft lost, destroying 347. Philippines, 7 losses against 103 destroyed. Darwin, Australia, 2 losses versus 30 destroyed. British Far East Fleet Air Arm, annihilated. Dutch East Indies Air Force, eliminated in days. At the center of this dominance flew the Mitsubishi, a 6M Zero, an aircraft that had rewritten the rules of fighter design with revolutionary philosophy that seemed impossible to Western engineers. When captured examples were tested by American engineers in 1942 after Aleutian recovery, they initially refused to believe the performance figures their instruments showed. A fighter with the range of a bomber, the maneuverability of a biplane trainer, and the firepower to destroy anything it caught? It seemed like propaganda or measurement error. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's ace of aces with 87 confirmed kills before his death, described the Zero in his recovered diary with the poetry of a man in love with his machine. "Flying the Zero is like wearing wings gifted by gods. The aircraft responds to thought, not just control input. American planes fly like trucks, powerful but clumsy, heavy and wasteful. They build fighters like they build cars, overbuilt, wasteful of materials, lacking elegance. The Zero is art, their planes are industry. The Zero achieved its miraculous performance through revolutionary design philosophy that Western engineers thought violated fundamental principles. Extra Super Duralumin, a classified aluminum alloy developed specifically for the Zero, created airframe structure 30% lighter than comparable American designs, a metallurgical achievement American engineers couldn't initially duplicate. But weight savings went beyond materials into philosophy that seemed insane to American designers trained to protect pilots. No armor plate protecting the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, radio equipment often removed to save 30 pounds. Every ounce sacrificed for performance. The result was an aircraft of breathtaking capability and terrifying face. Vulnerability, a fighter that could outmaneuver anything but died if touched by enemy fire. The first reports of the F6F Hellcat reached Japanese intelligence through neutral Swedish sources in early 1943, technical specifications that seemed like propaganda designed to mislead or perhaps deliberate misinformation. The aircraft weighed 12,186 pounds loaded, the Zero weighed 5,800 pounds. Its wing area spanned 334 square feet with a draggy radial engine protruding from the nose. It carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition when Zeros carried 500. Armor plate everywhere. Bulletproof glass. Self-sealing tanks holding 250 gallons of fuel. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had meticulously planned the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed the specifications at Combined Fleet Headquarters. His analysis, preserved in the Japanese Defense Archives, was dismissively confident. The Americans have learned nothing from their defeats. This Hellcat represents the continuation of their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery, compensating for poor training with armor, relying on industrial production rather than warrior spirit. A Zero will fly circles around it. The mathematics seem to support his assessment with brutal clarity. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot gave it a turning radius of 612 feet, tight enough to stay inside any opponent's turn. The Hellcat's wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot suggested a turning radius over 900 feet. In a turning fight, the basis of all Japanese fighter tactics, the foundation of every manual, the core of every training exercise, the Hellcat would be helpless, unable to bring guns to bear, doomed to die. September 30th, 1943. Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission when he spotted them through broken clouds, 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast, silhouettes he didn't immediately recognize. His first thought, recorded in his after-action report, B-25 bombers on a strange heading toward our airspace. Then they turned and he saw the distinctive profile that intelligence briefings had described but he'd never seen in combat. Single engine, massive fuselage, wings that seemed too short for the body, the unmistakable shape of America's new fighter. First encounter with F6F type fighter. He would write with the precision expected of Japanese naval aviators. Initial impression: Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber airframe. Engaged with standard tactics, expecting easy victory. Standard tactics meant using the Zero's legendary turn rate to get on the enemy's tail, the maneuver that had destroyed hundreds of Allied fighters, the technique drilled into muscle memory through endless training. Fukui rolled into a diving turn, expecting the heavy American fighter to continue straight or attempt a clumsy turn, allowing him to curve smoothly onto its 6 o'clock position for an easy kill. Instead, something unprecedented happened that violated every tactical assumption he'd been taught. The Hellcat didn't run. It didn't try to turn with him in the traditional dogfight Japanese doctrine anticipated. It went vertical. The Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai's, 1,130 horsepower drove the Hellcat upward at 3,500 feet per minute, climbing like nothing Fukui had ever seen. Fukui, attempting to follow in his lighter Zero, watched his airspeed decay as the aircraft struggled against gravity without the power to maintain the climb. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible for its weight. A hammerhead turn that dropped it directly onto Fukui's tail with perfect positioning. The American opened fire at 400 meters, Fukui reported with the clinical precision of shock. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected from intelligence. The volume of fire was unprecedented, overwhelming. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. Only by dropping into a spin did I escape certain death. Fukui survived, barely making it back to Marcus Island with his Zero riddled with holes that told the story of Hellcat firepower. His wingman, Petty Officer 2nd Class Masao Izuka, didn't return. Neither did the reconnaissance plane they were escorting. First blood to the Hellcat. The equation was beginning. October 5th, 1943. Task Force 14 struck Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what appeared to be another American nuisance raid. The hit-and-run attacks carriers had been launching for months, usually fleeing before Japanese fighters could fully engage and destroy them. This time would be catastrophically different. We climbed to 20,000 feet, Shiga recorded in his diary that evening. Below us, 12 F6F fighters in 3 divisions of 4. We held every advantage doctrine teaches: altitude, position, surprise, numerical parity. Victory was certain, absolutely certain. The engagement that followed shattered Japanese tactical doctrine built on 2 years of victories. As the Zeros dove on the Hellcats from perfect attack position, the American fighters didn't scatter in panic or attempt to turn into the attack as doctrine predicted. They maintained formation, accelerating in a gentle dive that kept their energy high, their speed building. When the Zeros opened fire at maximum range, hoping for lucky hits, the Hellcats simply absorbed the punishment with armor that turned 7.7mm rounds into sparks and self-sealing tanks that stopped fuel fires before they started. The Hellcats' armor included 212 pounds of plate, protecting the pilot more weight than a Zero's entire armament, 110 pounds around the oil system. Self-sealing tanks that could take dozens of hits and keep flying. As the Zeros exhausted their limited ammunition in diving passes that accomplished nothing, the Hellcats executed their counterattack with systematic precision. Instead of turning to dogfight as Japanese tactics anticipated, they used their weight as a weapon in ways Shiga had never imagined. Climbing at full power, they reached altitude where the Zero's engine struggled desperately for oxygen in thin air. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat was still producing 1,650 horsepower. The Zero was down to 900 horsepower, wheezing, struggling, dying. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, Shiga wrote that night, his hands shaking as he remembered. Their weight gave them speed we couldn't match no matter how we maneuvered. They would dive, fire those 6 terrible guns that seemed to fill the sky with tracers, then climb away before we could react or counter. We were helpless, completely, utterly helpless. 8 Zeros were shot down in 12 minutes. No Hellcats were lost. The mathematical equation of aerial combat had been rewritten, and Japanese pilots didn't yet understand the new formula. November 11th, 1943. Rabaul. The assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group sat in uncomfortable silence as Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanimizu briefed them on American tactics with the grim authority of a man who had survived what killed most others. Tanimizu, with 32 victories making him one of Japan's most successful pilots, was one of the very few who had survived multiple encounters with Hellcats and lived to understand why. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had characterized Japanese briefings since Pearl Harbor. "The Americans have changed the rules of engagement completely. They no longer fight our fight. They no longer accept the individual duels our doctrine is built upon. They fight like executioners, not warriors. Like machines, not men." Tanimizu explained what Japanese pilots were slowly, fatally learning through blood and death. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to never need to turn with it. Using a combat doctrine called energy fighting that Japanese training had never addressed, Hellcat pilots maintained speed and altitude, converting potential energy to kinetic energy in slashing attacks that gave Zero pilots no chance to use their superior maneuverability. "They work in pairs," Tanimizu continued, his hands demonstrating the tactics in the air. One high, one low. While you engage one, thinking you have advantage, the other is already diving on you from your blind spot. Their radios, which we laughed at for adding weight, let them coordinate perfectly. We fly as individual samurai seeking honor. They fight as a machine seeking efficiency. The silence in the tent was absolute. Every pilot understood what this meant. Their training was obsolete, their tactics suicidal, their philosophy inadequate. December 1943. Truck Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and understood better than most what American industrial capacity could achieve, now served as Air Operations Officer for the combined fleet. His inspection of damaged Zeros returning from encounters with Hellcats revealed the growing technology gap with mathematical precision. The disparity in firepower was brutal, mathematics that no amount of courage could overcome. Hellcat firepower. 6 Browning M. 2 machine guns firing 750 rounds per minute each equals 4,500 rounds per minute total. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. Zero firepower. 2 7.7mm machine guns, firing projectiles weighing 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second, equals 750 foot-pounds of energy. The Hellcat delivered nearly 5 times the hitting power while carrying 5 times the ammunition. More disturbing were the reports of American radar-guided fighter direction, a technology Japanese forces couldn't match or counter. While Japanese pilots still relied on eyesight to spot enemies, often seeing them too late, Hellcat pilots were guided to their targets by shipboard radar controllers who could see Japanese aircraft from 50 miles away. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi described his first radar-directed interception with the horror of a man realizing he was fighting blind. We were climbing through clouds at 18,000 feet when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact, no chance to maneuver. Hellcats diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned at our altitude, attacking from our blind spots. They knew where we were, our altitude, our course, our speed. We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark. It wasn't combat, it was execution. January 1944. The Japanese pilot crisis was becoming catastrophic in ways that would doom all future operations. The pre-war Imperial Navy pilot training program had been the world's most demanding, producing aviators of extraordinary skill. Training took 3 years, with pilots entering combat with 700 flight hours minimum. Army pilots received 500 hours. They were artists of aerial combat, trained in aerobatics, gunnery, navigation, and the spiritual philosophy of air fighting. By early 1944, the mathematics of attrition had destroyed this system. Naval pilots entering combat, 300 hours flight time. Army pilots, 200 hours. Fuel shortages meant most training done in gliders. Gunnery practice limited to 50 rounds per pilot. Formation flying, instrument flight, radio procedures. Eliminated meanwhile, American pilots were arriving with 300 hours minimum, including 50 hours in type the specific aircraft they would fly in combat. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, practiced carrier landings until automatic, learned energy tactics in safety over Texas airfields. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer at Kasumigara Naval Air Station, wrote in his final report before being sent to the front as a combat pilot himself, "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight, we have no ammunition for practice. He had never flown at night, we have no fuel for such training. He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat against Hellcats, 7 minutes from takeoff to death. October 12th to 16th, 1944. The Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the 2nd Air Fleet, committed everything to stop American carrier raids on Formosa, over 700 aircraft, including the last trained pilots from homeland training squadrons, the final reserve that was supposed to defend Japan itself. The Japanese claimed spectacular victory in radio broadcasts. 26 carriers and battleships sunk, 300 aircraft destroyed, the American fleet annihilated. The reality, discovered only after pilots returned and gun camera footage was developed, was catastrophic beyond imagination. Actual American losses: 89 aircraft, Japanese losses 329 aircraft, and almost every experienced pilot. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few surviving veterans, described the slaughter in his memoirs with the precision of trauma. The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude like predators who had studied our every move. As we climbed, they were above us. As we dove, they were below. They had divided the sky into grids, each section covered by a division of 4 Hellcats working in perfect coordination. It was not combat, it was systematic extermination. We were not warriors facing warriors, we were targets in a shooting gallery. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy committed its reconstituted carrier force to Operation Ago, the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power in the Pacific and turn the tide of war. 9 carriers, 450 aircraft. Their best remaining pilots, the final gamble. Against them, Task Force 58 with 15 carriers and 956 aircraft. 450 of them F6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his strikes in 4 waves, confident that Japanese pilot skill, the Zero's range advantage, and warrior spirit would prevail over American material superiority. The first wave of 69 aircraft launched at 0830 hours. American radar detected them at 150 miles long before any Japanese pilot could see the American fleet. Hellcats were vectored for interception with perfect positioning, altitude advantage, sun at their backs, approaching from Japanese blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort, saw the Hellcats minutes before engagement, and what he saw made his blood freeze. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, at least 60 of them, maybe more, waiting like a steel curtain we would have to fly through. We were at 18,000 feet, climbing. Every advantage was theirs, every tactical principle favored them, yet we had to continue. Orders demanded it. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Of 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were shot down. The survivors limped back to carriers that would themselves soon be under attack. Commander David McCampbell, CAG of Air Group 15, shot down 7 aircraft in that single engagement. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, got 6 more. The Zeros tried to turn with us, McCampbell reported with clinical precision. We simply refused to play their game. We'd make a high side run, shoot one down, zoom climb back to altitude using our superior power. They'd try to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would pick them off like targets. It was almost unfair. By day's end, the Japanese had lost 346 carrier aircraft, plus 50 land-based aircraft. American losses: 30 aircraft from all causes, most to anti-aircraft fire. Very few to Japanese fighters. American pilots in their ready rooms that evening, drinking coffee and eating ice cream that Japanese pilots hadn't seen in years, coined the term that would define the battle: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The enemy aircraft had been as helpless as game birds driven before hunters. Skill had been annihilated by system. Courage had been destroyed by technology. Warrior spirit had been buried under industrial production. October 24th, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. Commander David McCampbell would set his single mission record during this battle, an achievement that demonstrated complete Hellcat superiority. Leading 7 Hellcats from USS Essex, he intercepted a force of 60 Japanese aircraft bombers and fighters heading for the American fleet. The odds were nearly 9-1 against the Americans. In the ensuing 90-minute battle, McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers, while his wingman Roy Rushing destroyed 6 more. 15 aircraft destroyed by 7 Hellcats, all without loss. I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill, McCampbell recorded in his combat report. The Hellcat performed flawlessly throughout. Despite being outnumbered 8-1 and engaging for 90 minutes, not a single hit on my aircraft. The enemy couldn't touch us. This engagement demonstrated the complete reversal of air superiority. 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese aircraft, destroying 15 without loss. McCampbell's 2 ace-in-a-day performances, 7 kills on June 19th and 9 on October 24th, earned him the Medal of Honor and established him as the Navy's ace of aces with 34 victories. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf battles produced what Japanese military psychologists later termed Hellcat psychosis among surviving pilots, a condition of despair born from mathematical certainty of death. Admiral Ozawa, in his after-action report that reads like a confession of defeat, wrote, "The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved something we thought impossible, the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat was not an individual fighter, but a component in a vast machine of destruction. Our pilots, no matter how skilled or brave, were engaging not planes but a system. Individual courage meant nothing against systematic efficiency." The pilot shortage became so acute that by early 1945, training was reduced to catastrophic levels. Navy pilots, 40 to 50 hours total. Army pilots, 60 to 70 hours total. Kamikaze pilots, 40 to 50 hours total. Approximately 7 days of training before being sent to die April to June. 1,945. Operation Iceberg. The Japanese launched 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet off Okinawa, the final. Desperate transformation of air power from combat to suicide, from warrior tradition to human missiles. The Hellcat became not just a fighter, but a defender against the desperation of suicide attacks. The last line of defense between carriers and aircraft piloted by teenagers with 40 hours of training. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading his Flying Circus division of Hellcats using revolutionary tactics, shot down 23 Japanese aircraft during the campaign, perfecting coordination that made Japanese attacks suicidal even when pilots welcomed death. "We developed what we called the mowing machine," Valencia explained in his after-action reports. 4 Hellcats in line abreast, separated by 100 yards, would sweep through Japanese formations at high speed. Each pilot covered his sector with overlapping fields of fire. We'd make one pass, climb back to altitude, and repeat. It was systematic, efficient, deadly. The mathematics of the Okinawa campaign were stark testaments to Hellcat superiority. 38,038 combat sorties flown, 2,351 victories claimed, 249 losses to all causes, 9.5:1 ratio maintained. 80% of kamikaze aircraft prevented from reaching targets. By 1945, the technological gap had become unbridgeable. Japanese industry couldn't produce what American factories delivered routinely. The F6F Hellcat incorporated improvements that made it even deadlier than early models. Water injection boosting power to 2,200 horsepower. Zero-length rocket launchers for ground attack. Improved armor, increasing pilot protection. K-14 computing gun sight that calculated deflection. Automatically, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace with 28 official victories, modern historians estimate closer to 15, encountered Hellcats for the first time in June 1944 despite 2 years of Pacific combat. Despite his skill and experience, despite being one of Japan's finest pilots, he was nearly killed in his first engagement. "I performed my best aerobatics," he wrote in his autobiography, Samurai. "Loops, rolls, splits, scissor maneuvers, every technique I had perfected over 200 combats against inferior aircraft. The Hellcat followed easily, almost casually, staying on my tail no matter what I did. I survived only because the American pilot made an error. He forgot to release his drop tank before combat, which degraded his performance slightly. That single mistake saved my life." By war's end, the F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, while losing only 270 aircraft to enemy fighters, a 19.3:1 kill ratio that stands as one of the most lopsided victory records in aviation history. Additional achievements: produced 305 US Navy aces, accounted for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories, flew 66,530 combat sorties, destroyed 209 enemy ships. The human cost for sea-to-air, Japan was catastrophic beyond statistics. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who had started the war, the elite graduates of rigorous training, the finest pilots Japan had ever produced, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained by August 1945. The rest were dead, most killed by Hellcats. The transformation of Japanese naval aviation from an elite force to kamikaze operations represented the ultimate admission of Hellcat superiority. Unable to compete conventionally, Japan turned its pilots into guided missiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the kamikaze program, justified it with stark, horrifying mathematics. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, probability of success is near zero. The Hellcats will destroy it before it reaches attack position. If the Zero becomes a bomb, probability of hitting increases to 30%. The pilot dies either way, at least as a kamikaze. His death has meaning, his sacrifice damages the enemy. On October 25, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's ace of aces, escorted the first official kamikaze mission led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. Nishizawa claimed his 86th and 87th victories during this mission, 2 F6F Hellcats. The next day, October 26, 1944, Nishizawa died as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft shot down by Hellcats from VF-14. Japan's greatest ace, helpless without a fighter, fell to the very aircraft he had briefly bested in his final combat. August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. At Atsugi Airfield, Captain Minoru Genda, who had dismissed the Hellcat as weight over finesse in 1943, listened to the Emperor's words, announcing unconditional surrender. Around him sat the remnants of Japanese naval aviation, teenage pilots with 40 hours of flight time, aircraft cobbled together from spare parts, fuel tanks nearly empty. That same day, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31, flying from USS Belleau Wood, shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber at 2 p.m., the last aerial victory of World War II, achieved by a Hellcat. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the surrender broadcast, was approaching the American fleet when Moore intercepted him. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns ended the Pacific Air War as it had been fought for 2 years, with Hellcat superiority. September 1945. Atsugi Airfield. The first American aircraft to land in Japan after the surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown, a deliberate choice to demonstrate what had defeated them. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crew lined the runway to see their tormentor up close, to understand the machine that had destroyed their air force. American pilot Lieutenant Robert Vossler, an ace with 19 victories, demonstrated the Hellcat's capabilities to assemble Japanese pilots' casual aerobatics that would have torn a Zero apart, performed with ease. "You have to understand," Vossler told them through an interpreter, watching their faces as comprehension dawned. "This isn't even pushing it. In combat with water injection, it's 20% more powerful than what you're seeing. The plane is stressed for 13 Gs. I've never managed to break one, no matter how hard I tried." Japanese engineers studying captured Hellcats after the war discovered the true extent of American industrial superiority that had doomed them. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained 2,804 precision-machined parts, each interchangeable with any other R2800 engine. American factories could build thousands of engines where every component fit perfectly. The Nakajima Sakai required hand-fitting of components. No two engines were exactly alike. Mass production was impossible. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, studied the Hellcat extensively after the war. His conclusion was devastating to Japanese pride. We designed an aircraft for 1,941. They designed an aircraft system for 1,945. While we were perfecting the sword through craftsmanship, they were building the industrial age through ATV times, systematic production. We thought we were samurai. They proved we were artisans facing industrialists. Grumman's production of the Hellcat itself became a weapon that crushed Japan through sheer numbers. The Bethpage, New York factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak production, a new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes, 1 per hour, 24 per day, 168 per week. The company produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months, a feat Japanese industry couldn't comprehend or counter. In 1944, Japan produced 5,100 fighters of all types. America produced 35,000 fighters that year alone, 7 times Japanese production, while also fighting in Europe. The production system included innovations that seemed impossible to Japanese observers trained in hand craftsmanship. Color-coded assembly instructions, shifts operating continuously, quality maintained despite speed, interchangeable parts across all aircraft. The Hellcat didn't just win battles, it revolutionized naval warfare doctrine forever. Pre-war thinking assumed carriers were vulnerable platforms that needed to strike first to survive. The Hellcat inverted this completely. Carriers became fortresses that could absorb and repel any air attack. Admiral Mark Mitchell, commander of Task Force 58, understood this transformation. With the Hellcat, we don't need to find the enemy first. Let them come. The F6F will destroy them at our convenience. This confidence allowed unprecedented offensive operations. American carriers could park off enemy coastlines for weeks, their Hellcat umbrellas making them essentially invulnerable to air attack, a revolution in naval warfare. Beyond technology, the Hellcat represented a cultural philosophy that invalidated Japanese military doctrine at its foundation. The samurai tradition emphasized individual excellence, spiritual strength, and acceptance of death as honorable. The Hellcat embodied systematic efficiency, material superiority, and preservation of life as paramount. This philosophical gulf meant Japanese pilots couldn't adapt to Hellcat tactics even when they understood them intellectually. The concept of refusing combat when disadvantaged, fundamental to Hellcat doctrine, was literally unthinkable to Japanese pilots trained in Bushido warrior code. In 1962, the United States Navy held a symposium on Pacific War aviation at the Naval War College. American and Japanese veterans gathered to discuss the conflict with 17 years of historical perspective. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces with 34 victories, stated with finality, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. Not just battles, the entire war. It destroyed Japanese aviation systematically and made our victory inevitable." Commander Saburo Sakai, attending as an honored guest despite having fought against America, responded with brutal honesty. The Zero was a superior fighter aircraft in maneuverability. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system in every way that mattered. We never understood the difference until far too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. We thought aerial combat was about individual skill. You proved it was about systematic superiority. The Hellcat's dominance can be reduced to simple mathematics that tell a profound story of industrial democracy defeating warrior aristocracy. Kill ratio: 19-1 overall, 13-1 specifically against Zero's Hellcats, produced 12,275 inches. 30 months, Zero's produced 1,943 to 1,945. Approximately 6,000 American pilots trained on Hellcats, over 5,000 Japanese pilots remaining by August 1,945. Fewer than 100 combat capable. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who had commanded the Japanese fleet at Philippine Sea and watched his air groups destroyed, provided perhaps the most honest assessment in his 1969 memoir. We laughed at the Hellcat because we didn't understand it represented not just an aircraft but an entire Rabaul, civilization's approach to war, systematic, industrial, unstoppable. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces had ceased to exist. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai lived until 2000, surviving 58 years after the war he fought. In his final interview, conducted weeks before his death, he was asked about the Hellcat. His response captured the totality of its dominance with the wisdom of age. The Zero made Japan a great naval power for 2 years. The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed itself to be. We thought we were samurai facing lesser warriors. The Hellcat showed us we were artisans facing industrialists, individuals facing systems, past facing future. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live, or because they were lucky. That is the ultimate defeat existing at your enemy's discretion, knowing you were helpless before their superiority. The F6F Hellcat entered service weighing twice what the Zero weighed, carrying armor the Zero didn't have, powered by an engine the Japanese couldn't build, armed with weapons they couldn't match, guided by radars they couldn't detect, flown by pilots they couldn't equal in training, and produced in numbers they couldn't comprehend. Japanese pilots had laughed at it in September 1943 because they didn't understand that every extra pound represented not weakness, but the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors, that valued pilot lives over aircraft performance. By the time they understood, by the time mockery turned to terror, confidence to despair, warrior spirit to kamikaze desperation, their laughter had turned to final letters home, their air force to memory, their dominance to complete defeat. The Hellcat hadn't just defeated the Zero. It had destroyed an entire philosophy of warfare, proving definitively that in modern combat, the nation that could build the better system would annihilate the nation that could only build better individual warriors. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did.